I didn't notice it at first because it felt normal, polite even. I explained why I was tired. I explained why I needed space. I explained why I changed my mind. I explained my silences, my moods, my boundaries, my decisions, until one day I realized something unsettling. I wasn't communicating. I was asking for permission. Permission to feel what I felt. Permission to want what I wanted. Permission to exist without being corrected. And the more I explained myself, the smaller I became. Not visibly, not dramatically, but internally, slowly. As if every explanation transferred a little authority away from me and placed it in someone else's hands, I began to live as though my inner life required external approval, as though my experiences were only real once they had been understood, validated, and accepted by others. And the most disturbing part was this. I thought I was being reasonable, mature, considerate. I thought this was what emotionally intelligent people did. It took time to see the truth. That compulsive self-explanation is not kindness. It is fear with good manners, fear of being misunderstood, fear of being rejected, fear of standing alone inside your own experience. And once you see this, you can't unsee it. You start to notice how often people explain themselves not because they want to be known, but because they are terrified of being disapproved of. How often silence feels dangerous. How often saying nothing feels like a risk. This is not about arrogance. It is not about withdrawal. It is about something far more fundamental. The moment you stop explaining yourself compulsively, something inside you shifts. The center of gravity moves. And with that shift, your entire relationship with yourself and with others begins to change. There was a time when I believed that explaining myself was a sign of clarity, that putting words around my inner world made me more grounded, more reasonable, more evolved. I thought that if I could just articulate myself well enough, if I could make others understand my reasons, my feelings, my decisions, then friction would disappear and connection would naturally follow. What I didn't realize was that something else was happening underneath that habit. Something quieter and far more corrosive. Each explanation was not strengthening my position, it was weakening it. Slowly, almost invisibly, I was outsourcing my authority. This is how the pattern begins. Not as insecurity, but as adaptation. You explain yourself because you've learned that misunderstanding feels dangerous. You explain because silence has consequences. You explain because at some point in your life, not being clear, not being agreeable, not being convincing led to withdrawal, tension, or punishment. So you learned to preempt that pain. You learned to speak before being questioned, to justify before being judged, to translate yourself into something more acceptable, more palatable, more manageable for others. The problem is not the explanation itself. The problem is the need behind it, the subtle belief that if you don't explain, you will be misread, that if you are misread, you will be rejected. And that rejection, even imagined, feels like a threat to survival, so you keep talking, you keep clarifying, you keep proving, and over time, something fundamental shifts. You stop acting from what feels true and start acting from what can be defended. The psychologist Carl Jung recognized this dynamic as a sign of disconnection from the self. For Jung, the self is not the image you present to the world, but the inner center of gravity from which your life derives coherence and direction. When you are anchored there, your actions don't require constant justification. They have weight. They stand on their own. But when that anchor is weak or undeveloped, the ego compensates by seeking external confirmation. It explains, negotiates, performs, not because it wants to, but because it doesn't trust itself enough to remain silent. This is why compulsive self-explanation often feels exhausting. You are not just communicating. You are maintaining a psychological contract. You are reassuring others that your existence makes sense, that your emotions are reasonable, that your boundaries are fair. And every time you do this, you reinforce a hidden assumption. My inner experience is not valid on its own. It must be processed through someone else's understanding to become real. This assumption rarely forms in adulthood. It is inherited. It is learned early in environments where feelings were questioned, dismissed, minimized, or reframed before they were acknowledged, where being emotional meant being difficult, where silence was interpreted as defiance, where expressing yourself freely carried consequences. In such environments, the child learns that safety depends on explanation, that being understood is a prerequisite for being accepted, and so explanation becomes a survival strategy. But survival strategies age poorly. What once protected you begins to imprison you. As an adult, you no longer depend on those early figures for survival, yet the pattern persists. You still explain your boundaries. You still justify your exhaustion. You still rationalize your sadness. You still soften your truth to avoid discomfort. And without noticing, you begin to live as though your life requires approval to proceed. This is where authority erodes. Not in one decisive moment, but through repetition. Each time you explain instead of simply stating. Each time you defend instead of standing. Each time you over-clarify instead of allowing space. Authority does not disappear dramatically. It dissolves, and what replaces it is anxiety. The anxiety of being misinterpreted. The anxiety of being disliked, the anxiety of not being enough without a narrative to support you. The tragedy is that the world rarely rewards this effort. The more you explain, the more explanations are expected. The more you justify, the more justification is demanded. Because explanation signals doubt. It tells others that your position is negotiable, that your boundaries are flexible, that your sense of self is open to revision. And so the cycle continues. You explain to be safe. The explanation makes you less safe. You explain again to restore balance. And each time, you move further away from yourself. This is not about becoming silent or cold. It is not about refusing dialogue. It is about recognizing the difference between communication and submission, between expression and self-erasure, between sharing who you are and asking to be allowed to be who you are. That distinction changes everything, and until it is seen clearly, the habit of explanation will continue to masquerade as maturity, while quietly hollowing out the very center you need to live with strength. The childhood contract you never renegotiated. What makes the need to explain yourself so difficult to break is that it doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like reality, like gravity, as if the world simply works this way. You speak, you justify, you soften, you clarify, because that is how you learn to stay connected. Long before it became a habit, it was a contract, an unspoken agreement formed early, when belonging felt conditional and safety depended on being acceptable. This contract is not written in words, it is written in reactions, in the sighs that followed your emotions, in the looks that communicated disapproval before any explanation was offered, in the moments where your feelings were met, not with curiosity, but with correction. You learned slowly and thoroughly that your inner experience was negotiable, that it needed translation, that it was safer to explain than to simply be. The psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott described how children adapt to such environments by developing what he called the false self, a psychological structure designed to meet external expectations at the cost of internal authenticity. The false self is not deceitful, it is protective, it exists to ensure continuity of connection, and it does so by monitoring, adjusting, and explaining, constantly. The child learns to present what will be received rather than what is felt. When this adaptation works too well, it follows you into adulthood. You become skilled at anticipating reactions. You sense disapproval before it's voiced. You feel the pressure to justify before anyone asks. And because this pattern once kept you safe, it feels irresponsible to abandon it. Silence feels dangerous. Directness feels rude. Unexplained boundaries feel selfish, and so you keep explaining, not because you are unsure of yourself, but because you were trained to doubt yourself in the presence of others. The cost of this training is subtle, but immense. You begin to experience your life from the outside in. You monitor how your actions will be perceived before you check whether they are aligned. You shape your truth into something more defensible, more reasonable, more digestible. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you lose access to your own internal authority, the sense that what you feel is valid before it is understood. This is why explaining yourself often feels urgent. It's not about clarity, it's about anxiety, a fear that if you do not make yourself legible, you will be misunderstood. And if you are misunderstood, you will be rejected. The explanation becomes a preemptive strike against abandonment, a way to stay ahead of judgment, a way to control how you are seen so you don't have to face how it feels to stand alone inside your own experience. But control is not freedom, and the need to explain is not neutrality. It is positioning yourself below the gaze of others. Each explanation subtly reinforces the idea that your inner life requires approval, that your boundaries must be justified, that your silence is suspicious, that your no must come with reasons. Over time, this creates a psychological posture of submission that is so normalized it feels invisible. What makes this especially difficult to see is that society rewards it. People who explain themselves are seen as cooperative, emotionally intelligent, easy to work with. They smooth interactions, they reduce friction, they are praised for being reasonable. But reasonableness, when built on self-erasure, becomes a form of quiet violence against the self. You are accepted, but at the cost of being intact. This is where the old contract begins to fail you. The world you live in now is not the world you adapted to then. The authority figures are gone, but their voices remain. And the explanations you offer today are no longer protecting a child. They are constraining an adult. A self capable of holding discomfort, of surviving misunderstanding, of existing without consensus. The question is no longer whether you learned this pattern. You did. The question is whether you will continue honoring a contract that no longer serves you. Because every time you explain yourself unnecessarily, you are reenacting a past dependency in a present moment that does not require it. And the first step toward breaking that cycle is not silence. It is recognizing that you are no longer asking to be understood. You are asking to be allowed. Why silence feels like a threat. If explanation were merely a habit, it would be easy to abandon. You would notice it, correct it, and move on. But the reason it persists is because silence does not feel neutral to the nervous system that learned to survive through justification. Silence feels dangerous, exposed, like stepping into open air without armor. The body reacts before the mind has time to reason. The chest tightens. The impulse to speak rises, not because there is something to say, but because not saying anything feels like a loss of control. This is where most people misunderstand what is happening inside them. They assume they are explaining themselves because they value clarity. In reality, they are explaining themselves because silence activates an old fear. The fear of being misinterpreted, the fear of being judged unfairly, the fear of being seen and rejected without recourse. Explanation feels safer because it gives the illusion of influence. If I speak enough, maybe I can shape how this goes. If I clarify enough, maybe I can avoid pain. But this safety is false. It soothes anxiety in the short term while reinforcing it in the long term. Every time you rush to explain, you teach your nervous system the same lesson. Silence is dangerous, and you are only safe when you are actively managing how others perceive you. Over time, this creates a hyper-vigilant posture toward relationships. You are no longer present. You are monitoring. You are scanning for signals of misunderstanding, adjusting your words before they are even needed. This is why silence feels heavier than speech. Speech disperses tension outward. Silence forces you to hold it. And holding tension without immediately resolving it requires a level of internal stability that many people were never allowed to develop. Stability comes from trusting that you can survive disapproval, misunderstanding, even rejection, without collapsing. If you were never given that experience early on, your system learned to avoid the risk entirely. The psychoanalyst Carl Jung would describe this as a weakly developed center of gravity in the psyche. When the center is external, when your sense of legitimacy depends on response, silence feels like falling. There is nothing to brace against, no feedback to confirm that you are still acceptable. And so you speak, not to express, but to stabilize yourself through the other. This is also why people often over-explain in moments of conflict or boundary setting. Saying no feels incomplete unless it is wrapped in reasons. Taking space feels rude unless it is justified. Changing direction feels irresponsible unless it is explained in advance. The underlying belief is always the same. If I do not make myself understandable, I will be punished. Silence becomes synonymous with danger. But silence is only dangerous when you do not trust yourself to remain whole inside it. When your internal authority is underdeveloped, silence creates a vacuum. And vacuums pull. They pull anxiety, doubt, imagination. You begin to fill the silence with catastrophic interpretations. They'll think I'm wrong. They'll think I'm cold. They'll think I don't care. And because those interpretations feel unbearable, you speak to prevent them. What most people do not realize is that this reflexive explanation is not preventing misunderstanding. It is advertising insecurity. It tells others, often unconsciously, that your position is not stable, that it requires reinforcement, that it can be negotiated. And once that signal is sent, the dynamic shifts. Questions increase, boundaries are tested, clarifications are requested, because explanation invites engagement in places where none was required. This is why stopping explanation feels like stepping into a void. The void is not external, it is internal. It is the space where self-trust should be. And when that space has never been inhabited, silence feels like abandonment, not by others, but by yourself. You are used to accompanying yourself with words, reasons, defenses. Silence removes that companion and leaves you face to face with your own uncertainty. And yet this is precisely where something important begins. Not in the silence itself, but in what the silence reveals. It shows you where you do not yet trust yourself, where you still believe your truth needs witnesses to be real, where you are still living as if your inner experience must be approved before it can stand. The goal is not to become mute. It is to learn to remain intact without immediately justifying your existence, to let silence be uncomfortable without rushing to resolve it, to discover that nothing collapses when you do not explain, that the world does not end, that relationships either adjust or reveal themselves. Silence is not the absence of communication. It is the first test of internal authority. The hidden submission inside "let me explain." At some point, it becomes necessary to name what is actually happening, even if the word feels harsh. The compulsive need to explain yourself is not neutrality. It is not kindness. It is not emotional intelligence. It is submission, refined, socially acceptable, and almost invisible. A submission not to people themselves, but to their imagined judgment. To the internalized gaze that watches, evaluates, and silently asks you to justify your right to take up space. This is difficult to accept because submission is usually associated with weakness, and many people who explain themselves are anything but weak. They are thoughtful, introspective, conscientious. They care deeply about being fair, about not hurting others, about being understood. But submission does not always look like obedience. Sometimes it looks like over-responsibility, like carrying the emotional burden of everyone in the room, like believing it is your job to make your existence make sense to others. Each explanation carries an unspoken message. I am willing to negotiate my reality so you will remain comfortable. And when this becomes habitual, you stop noticing how much ground you give up. You explain why you feel the way you feel instead of allowing the feeling to stand. You justify your boundaries instead of enforcing them. You translate your intuition into logic so it can be approved. And in doing so, you slowly move yourself out of the center of your own life. The social philosopher Erich Fromm described a similar dynamic when he spoke about the escape from freedom. Faced with the anxiety of standing alone in one's own truth, many people unconsciously surrender their autonomy in exchange for acceptance. They trade internal authority for social harmony, not because they want to disappear, but because belonging feels safer than self-definition. What makes this pattern especially corrosive is that it often goes unchallenged. People around you may even reward it. They feel reassured by your explanations. They feel considered. They feel central. And so the dynamic reinforces itself. The more you explain, the more others expect explanation. The more you justify, the more justification is demanded. Until one day, you realize that your life has become a courtroom where you are both defendant and defense attorney, endlessly presenting arguments for your own legitimacy. This is where the cost becomes psychological. You begin to experience decision fatigue, not because decisions are difficult, but because every decision must be defended internally before it is even made. You start anticipating objections that haven't been raised. You rehearse explanations for choices no one has questioned. Your inner world becomes crowded with imaginary conversations where you are always trying to prove that what you feel, want, or need is reasonable. Over time, this erodes confidence in a very specific way. Not the loud confidence of performance, but the quiet confidence of self-trust. You stop asking yourself, "Is this true for me?" and start asking, "Will this make sense to them?" And when that question becomes primary, your life is no longer oriented around truth. It is oriented around approval. This is the moment where explanation turns into self-betrayal, not because explanation is wrong, but because it is no longer chosen. It is automatic, compulsive, a reflex designed to preempt discomfort at the cost of integrity. And integrity, once compromised repeatedly, does not announce its departure. It simply stops being felt. You may still function well, you may still be admired, you may still appear composed, but inside, something goes quiet, a firmness, a rootedness, a sense of being allowed to exist without narration. And without that, even praise feels hollow because it is never clear whether it is directed at you or at the version of you that explains itself well. Stopping this pattern is not about becoming abrupt or dismissive. It is about reclaiming authorship, about recognizing that you do not need to preemptively defend your experience in order for it to be valid, that your no does not require a thesis, that your silence does not imply guilt, that your presence does not need a justification. Until this is internalized, explanation will continue to function as a quiet submission, one that feels reasonable but slowly displaces you from your own center. What happens when you stop? This is the point where theory collapses and something practical begins. Because eventually, whether deliberately or by exhaustion, you stop explaining yourself. Not as a strategy, not as a performance, but because you simply cannot keep carrying the weight of justification anymore. And when that happens, the change is immediate, not always visible, but unmistakable. At first, the absence feels wrong. You notice the space where words used to rush in, the moment where you would normally clarify, soften, defend, or rationalize, and you don't. The silence arrives awkwardly, unevenly, without confidence, and almost instantly, the old anxiety appears. The familiar internal alarm. They're misunderstanding you. They're judging you. You should explain, just this once. This is the nervous system testing whether you really mean it. What's important here is that nothing catastrophic happens. The world does not collapse. Some people fill the silence with their own interpretations. Others move on. A few press harder, asking for explanations you're no longer willing to give. And this is where the real shift occurs. Because for the first time, you feel the difference between discomfort and danger. The discomfort is real, but the danger, the one you were trained to expect, never arrives. This is the moment you begin to reclaim internal authority, not as an idea, but as an experience. You learn, viscerally, that you can survive being misunderstood, that your sense of self does not disintegrate when someone disapproves, that your boundaries do not require consensus to hold. This realization is not dramatic. It settles slowly, quietly. But once it settles, it changes the way you move through the world. You begin to notice how much energy was previously spent managing perception, how much attention was devoted to smoothing reactions, preempting conflict, ensuring coherence in other people's minds. Without that constant output, something returns to you. Presence, focus, a strange, unfamiliar calm. Not because life becomes easier, but because it becomes simpler. You stop splitting yourself between what you feel and what you present. This is also where relationships begin to reorganize. Not all at once, not with confrontation, but with clarity. Some connections deepen because they were never dependent on your submission in the first place. Others become strained because they relied on your explanations to maintain balance. People who benefited from your self-doubt may become uncomfortable. They may accuse you of being distant, cold, or changed. And in a sense, they are right. You have changed. You are no longer available in the same way. What matters is how you respond internally. The old version of you would have rushed to explain the change, to reassure, to make it understandable. The new posture resists that impulse, not out of hostility, but out of self-respect. You allow others to have their reactions without managing them. You allow relationships to reveal what they are without intervening to preserve them. This is not cruelty, it is honesty. Over time, something subtle becomes apparent. Your words begin to carry more weight. Not because you speak more, but because you speak less. When you do choose to explain, it is no longer compulsive, it is deliberate, chosen, rooted in expression rather than defense. And people sense this difference, even if they cannot articulate it. They respond differently, they listen differently, or they move away. Both outcomes are information. Most importantly, your relationship with yourself changes. You begin to trust your own internal signals without immediately translating them. You feel less pressure to be coherent at all times. You allow emotions to exist without justification. You act from alignment rather than argument. And in doing so, you step out of the role of the defendant in your own life. This is where the script could become dramatic, but it doesn't need to. Because the truth is simpler. When you stop explaining yourself, you don't become powerful overnight. You become present. And presence, sustained over time, does something far more enduring than confidence ever could. It gives you your life back. Why people react when you no longer explain. One of the most confusing moments in this process is realizing that your silence does not land neutrally. You may feel calmer, clearer, more grounded, but the world around you may not respond with the same ease. In fact, some people react strongly, subtly at first, then unmistakably. They ask more questions. They probe. They imply that something is wrong. And if you're not careful, this reaction can pull you straight back into the old habit of explaining yourself just to restore equilibrium. This reaction is not accidental. When you stop explaining yourself, you disrupt an unspoken psychological arrangement. You remove something others were unconsciously relying on. Your explanations once functioned as reassurance, not only for you, but for them. They confirmed that you were predictable, manageable, readable. When that reassurance disappears, discomfort surfaces, and discomfort seeks resolution. This is why silence often provokes interpretation. People fill the absence of explanation with assumptions. They project motives. They narrate your quiet in ways that reflect their own needs and insecurities. Some assume arrogance, others assume withdrawal. Some interpret your groundedness as coldness. What they are really reacting to is the loss of control. Explanation made you accessible. Silence restores your autonomy. The philosopher Hannah Arendt observed that power does not announce itself loudly. It emerges where justification is no longer required. Authority, in its mature form, does not argue for its legitimacy. It simply is. And this is precisely what unsettles people who are accustomed to negotiating their place in the world through emotional leverage, obligation, or guilt. Your silence breaks the pattern. This is also where many people abandon the process. Not because they doubt its truth, but because they cannot tolerate the relational turbulence it creates. The impulse to explain returns dressed as empathy. I don't want them to misunderstand me. I don't want to create tension. I don't want to hurt anyone. These thoughts sound compassionate, but beneath them is the old fear. If I don't manage this, I will lose connection. What this moment demands is discernment. Not every reaction deserves correction. Not every misunderstanding requires clarification, and not every discomfort is yours to resolve. When you rush to explain yourself in order to soothe others, you re-enter the role you were leaving. You make their comfort your responsibility again, and in doing so, you quietly revoke the authority you were beginning to inhabit. This does not mean becoming indifferent. It means recognizing the difference between responsibility and over-responsibility. You are responsible for your actions. You are not responsible for how those actions are interpreted by everyone else. You can communicate without justifying. You can speak without defending. You can be clear without being exhaustive. This distinction is where maturity lives. Over time, something stabilizes. People recalibrate or they drift away. Conversations become simpler. Power struggles lose momentum. You notice fewer emotional negotiations and more straightforward interactions. And perhaps most importantly, you feel less compelled to perform coherence at all times. You allow complexity to exist without resolution. You let your inner life remain partially private. This is not withdrawal from the world. It is a return to proportion. You no longer offer explanations as a peace offering. You offer presence instead. And presence has a different texture. It does not seek agreement. It does not chase approval. It invites respect or reveals its absence. This is the quiet threshold, the moment where silence stops feeling like resistance and starts feeling like alignment, where you realize that the reactions of others are not obstacles to overcome, but information to receive. They show you which relationships were built on mutual respect and which were built on your willingness to diminish yourself. And once you see that clearly, you don't rush to explain it. You let it stand. When silence becomes integrity. At a certain point, silence stops feeling like something you are doing and starts feeling like something you are. It no longer requires effort. You don't have to remind yourself not to explain. The impulse simply weakens, as if the psyche itself has learned a new posture. Not defensive, not performative, just upright. This is the moment where silence is no longer restraint, it is coherence. What changes first is not how others see you, but how you experience yourself. There is less internal friction, fewer rehearsed conversations, fewer imagined defenses. You begin to act, speak, and decide from a quieter place, one that does not need to justify its existence in advance. Your inner life no longer feels like a case to be argued. It feels like something you are allowed to inhabit without commentary. This is what integrity actually feels like. Not moral superiority, not rigidity, but alignment. The sensation that your inner signals and outer actions are no longer in conflict. You say less, but what you say carries more weight because it is no longer padded with fear. You choose more carefully, not because you are cautious, but because you are no longer negotiating with yourself at every turn. And something subtle happens here. You begin to feel less urgency to be understood, not because you've given up on connection, but because you've stopped confusing understanding with permission. You realize that being misunderstood is not the same as being invalidated, that someone else's confusion does not erase your truth, That disagreement does not dissolve your right to exist as you are. This is where the process becomes quietly uplifting, not in an emotional, inspirational way, but in a grounded, stabilizing one. You feel more solid, more present, less scattered. Life does not become easier, but it becomes less divided. You are no longer split between who you are and who you are trying to be for others. You also begin to notice something else. The people who remain in your life begin to interact with you differently. Conversations simplify, boundaries hold without explanation. Respect appears not because you demanded it, but because you stopped undermining yourself. And where respect does not appear, clarity does. You no longer waste energy maintaining dynamics that only function when you are smaller. This does not mean you become unreachable. You still communicate. You still explain when explanation is appropriate. But the explanation is no longer compulsive. It is offered, not leaked. It comes from choice, not fear. And because of that, it no longer costs you anything. There is also a quieter, more intimate shift. You begin to trust your own internal experience without immediately translating it into something acceptable. You allow emotions to be what they are before analyzing them. You let decisions stand without rehearsing defenses. You stop apologizing for needing space, for changing, for not having a perfectly articulated reason. This is where the old anxiety loses its grip, not because you conquered it, but because it no longer has a role to play. Anxiety fed on the belief that you had to manage perception to stay safe. When that belief dissolves, anxiety has nowhere to anchor itself. It may still appear, but it no longer directs your behavior. And this is the most important part. You begin to experience your life as yours, not as a performance, not as a negotiation, not as something constantly adjusted to avoid friction, but as something you are actively inhabiting. You feel less like a character being evaluated and more like a person moving through reality with consent. This is not transformation as spectacle, it is transformation as posture, quiet, unimpressive, profound, and it leads to a simple but irreversible conclusion. You were never meant to be explained. You were meant to be lived. When you stop explaining yourself, you don't disappear. You finally arrive.